It's a minute and a half to showtime, and I'll just get rolling. My name is Joe Decuir. I had the great luck to work at Atari from the end of '75 to the middle of '79. I'll explain something. IEEE is the world's largest technical professional society. It has 440,000 members worldwide. More than half of them are outside of the United States. I might run for region director next year, which would cover the Western United States. An IEEE fellow. I would like to help Wozniak become an IEEE fellow. You become a fellow if you've done work that's considered really significant in the industry. And it took them a while to notice, but they decided that co-inventing video games and personal computers and whatnot probably qualifies. So they decided I'm a fellow. And the important point for me is not that it says fellow. The important point is that local universities in the Seattle area will teach that with at least as much prestige as an actual PhD. So I can become a college professor in my encore career, which is my plan. IEEE also has a Consumer Electronics Society Board of Governors, and I'm on it, and I'm a distinguished lecturer. They pay me, reimburse me to travel around the world and explain the work I do now, which is not video games and personal computers, it's wireless communications and Bluetooth in particular. Anyway, with that, it's 2 o'clock on the nose, and we'll explain why is this guy wasting our time here. Okay, here's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about bringing the story home and what that means. Talk about early video games, the market problem we were trying to solve in 1976. Do you remember that? 39 years ago. How the 6502 changed things. I'll explain what a 6502 is and why it changed things. We had, of course, then to turn a prototype into a product, we had to design a game, and I'll get into some of the details there. Dave Crane did a nice job earlier of explaining some of the weird things we did with it. We had brilliant game designers of whom he's a prime example, and Warshaw is another one. He's up next. What we think we learned from this process, and where you can learn more. So, first of all, entertainment. We in the consumer electronics industry sell stuff to people, and what we're basically selling is access to stories. And the network owned them first, and then we brought them home. So, in 1970, I'm in the middle of college, and stories were owned by public media. You know, movie companies made films and showed them to us in theaters. TV networks made news and assorted shows, and they put them on TV interspersed with commercials that we could watch at home. Musicians recorded songs. Maybe they did concerts, and they recorded vinyl records. Do you remember vinyl records? Right? And we could go to the store and buy those and bring them home and play them on our record players. Okay? And there was also stories that were in theaters. If you were lucky and spent the money, you could go to the West End in London or, you know, New York or other places and watch actual live performances of stuff. Okay? We, in none of those cases, controlled the story. To get to the control of the story, you have to go much farther back in time, when we would be musicians for each other and tell stories to each other. Or when your mom and dad would tell you stories when they're trying to get you to sleep. Remember those? Vaguely? Okay. Let's go forward because it's going to change. So, first, video games. 1968. Ralph Baer is working for a defense contractor in Manchester, New Hampshire. But he has this inspiration that it should be possible to build a gadget that puts something interactive on your TV set. Now, he wasn't working for a consumer electronics company, so they had no idea what to do with him. Eventually, they paid him some money to develop the stuff on the grounds that maybe he can license it to somebody else, which he eventually did. He built a gadget called the Brown Box, and which would work in a family home. I had the great luck to finally go and make a pilgrimage to this guy's house in April a year ago He died last December. This is the guy. Last year, at 93 years old, he's still sitting in his basement designing electronic toys. I am in awe of this man. I have no idea whether I'll be smart enough to design anything when I'm 93. But his employer licensed his stuff to Magnavox, which became the Odyssey. Some of you have heard of the Odyssey, right? So, meantime, video games started showing up in arcades. Al Alcorn was explaining that just a few hours ago about developing the original paddle games, which we called Pong. And so they built the arcade game business. So suddenly, there's a story, and the story is a contest between two people playing simulated Pong games that you pay quarters for, where if you put too many quarters in it, it stops working. Nice problem to have, okay? They brought out a home version, which Al explained a little bit earlier, and that was another raging success. So Atari knows they're onto something. They are selling a new story. It's a contest between you and another player, rather than something controlled by the other medium. So, in 1971, the microprocessor revolution starts showing up. The Intel 4004 comes out. I get to work on these things at Berkeley in grad school. But the original ones from the early and mid-20th century were big and expensive, huge. I recommend go visit the Computer History Museum in Mountain View. Then they became commercial with IBM, then they got smaller with digital equipment, and then finally they got really tiny. In 1974, Intel brought out the 8008, which could handle 8K bytes of memory. And in 1975, we added the 8080 and the Motorola 6800, which had 16-bit address buses, so they could address 64K of memory. So this is coming along. We at Atari had a problem to solve. As Al pointed out, that we were innovative leisure. So what are we going to do here? In fact, Al had that great memo where he talked about, well, you're going to bring this home, and he was like, what? Where are we going to get the resources to do that? They had to sell out to Warner to get the material, get the money to do that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So we had a problem to solve. Atari was leading the arcade game business, starting with Pong. And then we started extending that story by building more complex games at home. The next clear move was to figure out how to bring those complicated games home to complete the square. And we knew at that point that other people had noticed us, and we had plenty of competition. True story. Summer of 1975, I'm working in medical electronics. In fact, I'm working in intensive care. And I'm walking down the street in Disneyland in Anaheim, California. And there's funny noises happening off to one side, and we go to investigate. And it turns out that there's Atari video games there. I had never played one before. And my brother Bob and I, who was half my age, I was 24 and he was 12, burned a lot of quarters playing Atari Tank. It was fun. He beat me. Didn't think any more of it for quite a while. But between that summer and that fall, I started learning how the 6502 processor worked on my own dime while I'm doing medical research. And I lose my job, coincidentally, so I have to find another one. And I know about a job in designing medical electronics in Orange County. And then a friend of mine says, well, you should talk to these buddies of mine here. They work at this Atari company. So I go interview with them. And I'm interviewed, and I pass the hardware stuff, and I pass the software stuff. And they kind of liked the fact that I'd been educating myself on how this microprocessor worked. And then they took me to the entry where they had a bunch of coin-op games with no coin slots. I'm going to be tested. So I slide over to the tank game so that when they test me, they at least test me on a machine I'm familiar with. I passed the interview. They offered me a job on the spot. I was so lucky. So we had some choices. As Al was explaining earlier, we built a single custom chip to do home Pong. And one of the models for building an extensible machine would be we'd build a different random logic chip for each new game. And it was pretty clear that that process wasn't going to scale. So we thought we would design a programmable system using these new microprocessors, but the microprocessors that were available in 1974 to 1975 were very expensive. Intel originally wanted $100 a piece for an 8080. This was not going to fly. But that's in the beginning of 1974. Worse, everybody doing games at that period that were general had bitmaps of some kind. And even if you want to do a very crude display, and suppose, you know, a 64 by 16 character array, let alone a bitmap, was going to cost, at that time, prohibitive amounts of money for a home video game console. A pure bitmap would be prohibitive. If you're going to do 512 by 256 bit, you're talking about 16K bytes of RAM. Now, those days, that was a lot of money. Today, that's nothing. Literally, pretty much nothing. Your average, you know, like my mobile phone, this thing probably has 16 gigs of RAM in it, maybe 32, right? This thing hanging around my neck, 32 gigs of RAM, right? But we're talking about 39, 38 years ago. Different economics. So we were thinking, and we were in the coin-up side of the company, we were building bitmaps. Of course, in coin-up, you have a much higher bill of materials and you put it in a big wooden cabinet, and maybe you can afford it. But we were thinking about a display that's 160 by 96 pixels by 2 bits deep, so it'd be 4 color. We thought that might cost us $25 in 1975. And in fact, something similar showed up. It was called the Fairchild Channel F. And it was very clunky, if you recall. A processor like the 6800 was quoted around $25 in large quantities. So where we're looking at you know, maybe $75 or $80 in bill of materials to build a bitmap-based video game in 1975. So what changed? So I was a member of the IEEE even at the time, and I went to the WestCon show in September of 1975 when a team of people introduced a new processor called the 6502. He left Motorola and he built something different from the 6800. It had replaced the enhancement mode NMOS by depletion mode NMOS. This is not a test. But they changed the kind of transistor. This is long before CMOS became popular. And instead of requiring 3 power supplies, it only needed 1. They adjusted the register architecture to define better memory addressing, which I'll talk about a little bit. And they adjusted the architecture for linear endianness versus for arithmetic pipelining. Again, this is computer science. There is no test later, but given the same computing resources, if you arrange them differently, it works faster. And it makes some things possible that weren't possible before, which is the point. So it was priced at $25 in onesies. They were offering us $5 a piece, only $5 a piece in large quantities. I bought one. Steve Wozniak bought one the same day, but I hadn't met him yet. And Ron Milner of Atari bought one the same day. I hadn't met him yet either. The depletion load made also the parts faster. 6800s were slower. And these architectural and design changes were decisive because they made it possible to do a line map rather than a screen map. So stepping back for a second, for those of you, most of you I assume are not schooled in computer architecture, but way back in the old days when we had to program really close to the iron, the 8080 had a pair of 8-bit registers, and if you wanted to do address arithmetic, you had to operate on the lower byte and then on the upper byte and then do the carry propagation manually to address tables and do anything interesting in terms of data processing. The 68 was a little, 100 was a little bit better, but not much. But it did have a nice trick. The first 256 addresses in memory were 0 page, and the processor could get to them quicker. So what happened with the next processor, the one that we all bought that was so cheap, was also better in another way. You could put a 16-bit memory pointer in 0 page, and then either pre-index into it with an 8-bit pointer, or post-index it off of another 8-bit pointer, the Y register. And we used this. This enabled us to do the address arithmetic on the fly rather than manually the slow way. And it meant we could write what we used to call a kernel. This is just what it looks like in terms of consecutive memory cycles. It would take the 8080 about 3 to 4 times as much memory cycles to do the same operations that this thing did in one pass.
Nominally 12 to 16 cycles.
Yeah.
Slower cycles.
Right.
Much slower cycles.
Much slower cycles. So, without understanding that in detail, it was fast enough to compute and write graphics on a line-by-line basis, which means we didn't need a frame buffer, only a line buffer. This saved, at that time in history, a lot of money. I mean, later we decided, well, Moore's Law caught up with this, of course, and then we went to a frame map memory, but we could afford it then. Here we couldn't. It could run at 1.2 megahertz, so we could get 76 memory cycles per horizontal line, maybe 25 instructions per line. So Milner and Mayer built a prototype, which is on the next slide. And my great piece of luck after that little story was they hired me to go up there to Nevada City, California, and make it work, because they designed it on paper and nothing worked yet. So here is what the old prototype looked like. It's now on display at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, donated by the Milners. So we did this. So now we have to generate a product. So I got sent to Los Gatos, that building that Al was talking about earlier. I was apprenticed to Jay Miner, a senior engineer on the next slide. He worked for Bob Brown, who in turn worked for Al Alcorn, who was on the stage at 11 o'clock.
You were the technology transfer. That's how we transfer.
Exactly. They stuffed the information into my head, and then they moved me to unpack. You know, if the guys up in Cyan just sent designs down, they would go into the round file. So I was, you know, it's like when they sent, who was the guy? They sent Stalin. Was it Stalin? No, they sent Lenin. They sent Lenin into Russia in the early 20th century to bring Bolshevism into Russia and take down Russia, turn it into something different, right? They put it in the hands of a person. Anyway, we built a team. We had ASIC chip designers and testers. We'd already just done this for the home Pong. And we needed game designers. So we hired Larry Wagner as the guy managing that group. And he in turn hired Dave Crane right over there, Al Miller, who is not here, Larry Kaplan, and Bob Whitehead. Those 4 guys later started Activision, but that's another story for another time. So here's my mentor, Jay Miner, rest in peace. 21 years he's gone. All right, so we looked at a program. The prototype is an existence proof. There's a famous guy named Brooks, and he's written a great collection of essays called The Mythical Man Month, and he says you have to plan to throw the first one away. The first one is proof that you can technically do something, and you can build plans around that. It doesn't mean you decide to take that and ship the prototype. The only people who do that now are the people writing apps for iPhones. They do that all the time. So we did a new system design with a CPU and an ASIC and a combo chip with memory and I/O and an external ROM on a cartridge. So it was basically 3 parts in the device and a ROM as the 4th part. and we decided that having RAM to load a program would cost too much. We actually considered briefly, let's have a cassette player and we'll play the code into the machine and load it into RAM. If you're going to do that, you have to spend the money on the RAM to load the code into in the first place. That's a bunch of money. And you have to talk to this slow cassette deck. It's much better if you can figure out a way to protect the ROM, to just plug the ROM in and go. That's what we did. We built then an emulation. We did a paper drawing of what the chip would eventually look like, and then we converted that to low power Schottky TTL and wire wrapped that to prove that we had the logic right. And then we gave that to the programmers to deface as they wish. Okay, so we kept the essentials. We took the 6502 and we cut it to a 28-pin package to save 50 cents. In retrospect, that was a mistake, but we didn't know this at the time. We took the 6530, which was a combo part with ROM and RAM, I/O and a timer. We ripped off the ROM and doubled the RAM, so we got 128 bytes. This was when RAM was really expensive. This thing had 1,000 bits of RAM. We built this ASIC television interface adapter with video, audio, and some external special I/O ports. And we allowed room in the design for 13 bits going to the cartridge so it logically could handle 2K or 4K bytes in the cartridge. That was another bit of premature optimization. It saved us 50 cents to have a 25-pin rather than a 30-pin cartridge. If we had designed it with a larger processor in the first place and a bigger connection in the first place, we could have evolved the design towards a personal computer rather than having to make a jump from one design to the next. One definition of evil is premature optimization. And we didn't foresee the success that we were going to have. We constantly, while we were working on this, thought that if we were successful, and we weren't assured of success, that this product might last 2 or 3 years before we had to obsolete it. If we didn't do it, our competitors would. So that's where we were, and that's what the system diagram looks like. This is actually copied out of my programmer's guide that Jay Miner signed. So you can see on the extreme left a place where the ROM plugs in, processor on the top, the multifunction device on the bottom, and the new television interface adapter over on the side. This is hand lettered. There's nothing to make the letters pretty. Sound circuits. We had 2 sound circuits, one per player, and it had a simple frequency divider, a noise generator, and some counters, and a multiplying 4-bit A-to-D converter. Fairly simple stuff. We had parallel I/O. We had those 2 9-pin connectors on there. We made that up. We said, okay, we're going to have up, down, left, right, and a fire button. So that's 5 connectors. And then we also wanted to support paddle games. So we made 2 more connectors for paddles. We had power out, and we had ground out, 9 pins. And we mapped them all into the parallel I/O. We had some optimization. Before we hired guys like Dave, the first prototype, collision was supposed to be figured out in software, but it turns out that detecting collisions in software is difficult. Basically, the programmer winds up having to construct a model of what's being displayed, even though there is no bitmap, and detect overlap. And it's a tremendous amount of trouble. Whereas I convinced Jay to put in 15 RS flip-flops. So if this thing touches this thing from a video standpoint, it just sets the flip-flop, and the processor can come by and read it, say, oh, that touched that, okay, and then clear them all, and then conduct its process again. It was a very small amount of chip area, and it saved the programmers a huge amount of trouble. And software optimization, Dave was referring to this earlier today. the process, to have binary counters horizontally would have cost 3 times as much area as the polynomial counters we actually use to position the moving objects. And this was the time when we didn't have extra area to burn. So we had this design replicated basically from Pong, where we have a polynomial counter that's doing horizontal retrace, a shorter polynomial counter that does the positions of the objects, it starts and stops during display time, and that artifact you talk about is a mistake that we made of using the wrong signal somewhere. And then what you had to do is you have to issue a reset somewhere, and then you have to offset the position from some reset. And I looked at this, and the programmers were desperate to not have to figure this all out for themselves. So I wrote a bit of what we would now call middleware, a device driver. So Larry Kaplan says, I want to put it here, 8-bit number. Okay, so I built a piece of code that would figure out where to issue the reset and what the offset would be from the reset. So Larry writes an 8-bit number. My code as middleware makes the hardware do what he expects it to do, and he doesn't have to know the details, or he shouldn't have to know the details. If we weren't doing it all the way down the screen, you wouldn't see those little artifacts, but we made a mistake and we were, as we say, too cheap to fix it. Anyway, as it was originally expected, we would do all this work during vertical retrace. And you would move the players and the missiles, which are the 1-bit things, and maybe even the ball to some place. And that's what this piece of middleware did. So around the time we shipped it, we had, that's a picture of my heavy sixer, 1977, and the 2 cartridges that I worked on, and 4 different pairs of controllers. The ones in the center are the classic joysticks. The ones next to them are the classic potentiometers, which have about 270 degrees of rotation. The driving controllers, which are actually gray-coded and which will rotate continuously, they were only used in the driving game. And we actually designed a small number of things that would use a keyboard controller, which are simple 4x3 arrays that we could scan. And I'll talk about them a little bit here. We did a basic math cartridge, for example. We used the keyboard controllers for that. We also did a really tiny basic. I don't think it sold very well. So going back to how do we get these things to work? In the vertical blank time, which is when nothing is being displayed, the system had time to think about stuff. It could read the console controls. It could process and act on any collisions that were detected. It could detect other changes like timeouts, and it could update the game status. In the display time, it's driving the screen very intensively on a line-by-line or pair-of-line basis, what we used to call the kernel. I would say of the living experts on the kernel, major example right there. There are, as he says, maybe 100 people who understand how to write kernels. And in the next one, I'm going to allude to this stuff in more detail. In the game state, you're trying to decide what is happening on the screen. What is the shape of the playfield? You want to figure out the location, orientation, and shape of 2 relatively complex moving objects, the players. Stepping back for a moment, Atari had an important advantage. Our competitors weren't game makers first. They were hardware makers. We were a game company first, who was then implementing that in certain markets. So we understood how the game players thought about things. And we understood that they were focused mostly on their own avatar and the avatar of the thing that they're competing with. And they spend less of their brain cells paying attention to the background. So we thought it was more important to build low-resolution background and relatively high-resolution players. our competitors were thinking about bitmaps, and they would have to compromise between the resolution of the background and the resolution of the foreground, and both of them ended up being clunky. It was too early for them. Stepping back, we did low resolution play field, relatively high resolution players and missiles and balls and whatnot. And we had enough sound to be useful, but not enough to get us into trouble. And then we had to translate the game state. Having decided the game state, we actually have to construct the tables that the kernel is going to use as it's running down the screen. So you compute the new values, you set up lots of pointers in zero page to do all the address arithmetic that I mentioned a few slides back, and then poll the hardware timer. We didn't have any interrupts in this system. So when you start at vertical retrace, you set a number, and you go off and do stuff that you know will finish in a certain amount of time, and then you pop out and wait for the timeout, and then you set vertical sync, then you wait 3 lines, and then you clear vertical sync, and then you go off and do some more processing until it's time to drive the display again. And you know that from watching the timer, because there are no interrupts. And again, the ability of the 6502 to compute this on a line-by-line basis made this possible. It would not have been possible to do this on a 6800 we tried, or on an 8080, which we didn't even bother to try. So, this one I can look at in a little bit more detail. I should have brought a laser pointer. I'm trying to build in 2 axes a timing diagram where time is going from left to right and top to bottom. Great. Good. Okay, so Dave was alluding to this a little bit also. I think he did a nice job. So on any given line, 160 color clocks worth are displayed, and about 68 color clocks are horizontal retrace time. So first of all, you have vertical retrace processing, where you look at the inputs, you look at and process collisions, you compute the new game state, including the score, right? That's 54 lines worth. Then in display, about maximum 208 lines on an ordinary old NTSC TV. National Television.
Never the same color twice.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Twice the same color.
So here we are. We set the display in a certain mode, and we display 2 scores corresponding to these players. And as luck would have it, they're color-coded because, in fact, we wrote the color once and it's the same color. Yeah. And then we started putting up display, and in this case, there's 20 bits that are either replicated or reversed, because we were, again, really cheap. It would have been nice if we had 20 whole bits instead of having only, 40 whole bits rather than 20 bits that we had to use once or twice. It would have increased the chip area at least 18 or 19% to double the number of horizontal bits when we were first doing the design. This was in 10 micron CMOS. Today they're talking about 20 nanometer CMOS. That's 500 times smaller in each axis than the stuff we were using 39 years ago. Okay? So running down the screen, some very busy stuff is computing pointers and reading all the background stuff, reading up whether to turn this thing on or not, and then reading the graphics in and then turning it off again, doing the same thing to the ball, et cetera, et cetera. Very busy. And we didn't know that it was possible to do this. Our charter from Allen Company was, can you display tank, and while you're at it, maybe you could do Pong too. So we focused on the more complicated one first. And our existence proof was we could get this to be playable. In fact, my job was to get the display working. We let Larry Wagner make it more interesting later with Invisible Tank and Billiards Tank and all that other stuff. My job was to get it to work at all. Got it there, right? So we could poll the potentiometer inputs. And so when I, as an afterthought, after we got this thing ready to ship, they said, oh, by the way, go do Pong. Okay. And I could think of a lot of different variations in Pong. So I wrote Video Olympics, and I got Bob Brown to consent that I only needed to have 50 different game variations. So there are 8 major games. Try something unplayable. Try foosball. It's really crazy. Anyway, this is the general program, and I'm going to go past it because you guys will probably make me answer questions later. So, to prepare it, having gotten it to that point, ASIC worked the first time, mercifully. And one of the lessons that we learned when we looked at the production history of Atari Home Pong, we discovered that they had not designed it for testability. It was an afterthought, right? So the tester actually, from its pins, had to completely play a game, which took several minutes. And that doubled, tripled the cost of production because it took so long. So when we designed this thing, one of the things we did is we took the logic diagram, put it up against the wall. We didn't have manual tools to do this. And we wanted to know whether or not each node on the device was controllable and testable. Meaning, can an automatic testing system force every piece of the chip into a known state and then determine if it is in the known state or not? And if it could, then we could build production testing equipment that was much cheaper than the cost of making the part in the first place. That's what we actually did. We learned something from that. Okay. We built a lot of prototyping systems to keep the designers tooled up. We had to do a system design with RFI shielding. This had a Faraday cage in it. Does anyone here know what a Faraday cage is? Right. You're keeping all the radiation in. We had to tool up a new factory. That's why we had to sell out to Warner, because we needed the money to tool up the new factory. And we did this in the Santa Clara Valley, not in some random East Asian country. We needed production test equipment and tooling. One of the things I spent my time in late was building tools that the production people would use to tell, is each unit sufficiently assembled, as opposed to, is the design appropriate? Because if you ship bad stuff to the end user, you light up the tech support lines and you've really made a major mistake for your company. And yes, we needed the money to cover all that. So, launch titles. So, the guys we hired were pretty busy. Larry wrote RC Battle. A guy haven't kept track of wrote Basic Math that used those keyboard controllers. Bob Whitehead wrote Blackjack. Larry and I wrote Combat. And we bundled that with the system because it was so popular. A guy named Riddle wrote the Indy 500 thing that used those gray-coded controllers. Bob Whitehead wrote Starship. This is where we started thinking, wait a second. We, the designers, had no idea that somebody could put up a moving star field. And Whitehead did that, and we thought, oh my God, there's stuff we didn't realize they could do. Larry Kaplan wrote Street Racer. Milner also wrote Surround. And like I say, at the tail end, I said, well, okay, we got to deliver Pong. Who's going to do Pong? Everybody else had more interesting things to do, so I wrote Pong. Competition at that time, the Channel F was developed at the same time. It illustrated all those problems. It had 128 by 64 pixel bitmap in 4-color. And it was, all the moving objects were drawn in the same common map, which means they moved very clunkily. And so it was, total production was 250,000 units over time, but compared to the 2600 coming from a games design first company, it lost. What did we learn from this in the production history? Well, we were, to put it mildly, nicely surprised. The game designers turned out to be much more creative than we anticipated. We were trying to be cheap, but they took the fact that we had given them control of the vertical and went nuts. So we moved the functionality from the hardware to software. The game designers then followed the beam. There is a terrific book I recommend from the MIT Press called Racing the Beam. And it's a scholarly book about this machine. It has a chapter on Dave's pitfall, amongst others. It covers all this stuff in detail. If you're a scholar of this, go get the book. I'm planning to write its sequel. Okay, over 1,000 game cartridges were defined for this system. The most important ports from arcades were Pac-Man and Missile Command and Space Invaders and Asteroids. I think Atari did Missile Command ourselves. Space Invaders and Pac-Man came from somebody else. I think Atari did Asteroids too, correct? Right. Right. And the list of original games is huge. In my opinion, my short list of the best original games for this platform, Dave's here. He did Pitfall. Warren Robinette did did Adventure. Carol Shaw, also at Activision at the time, did River Raid. That was a vertical scroll thing. Dave's Pitfall had things moving horizontally. And Yar's Revenge, Warsaw is following me on this stage. So we sold 250,000 units the first year. Original production stopped in '89. Atari Corp., the successor to Atari Inc., stopped shipping with about 30 million. The Nintendo NES, which came out in '85, replaced Atari as the leading video game console. But you can still buy them today. Okay? I have a Flashback 2, which was a re-engineered design in 3-volt CMOS that does the original chips. Somebody has built a Flashback 5, which is based on an emulator with 92 games built into it. You can buy that now for $35 or $40. In fact, they might have them at Fred Meyer. So, this is a photograph of my original 1977 Heavy Sixer, they call it. And there is a 2014 Flashback 5.0. Even more to the point, if you go out there on the floor and find Atari Age, people are still doing new games for this platform now. 3 years ago, a friend of mine, Ed Fries, he ported Halo from the Xbox to this platform. Now, the interesting thing is, obviously the graphics are much cruder. The interesting thing is, if you play that game, it's actually playable. It's actually, you can invest brain cells in how well your avatar is doing, which is what games are really about. They're not about, whether you can render the zits on the face of the player, which an Xbox can do, but whether you suspend your disbelief and get invested in the game. That's what makes the game important. And this is like, Ed Fries did that work 33 years after the game was first introduced. 33 years! That's like a generation and a half. I'm friends with him in Seattle. Okay, so the lessons learned. We put the definition of the display in the hands of the game designers, who were smarter than we were. And our conclusion was that our second system could not simply be another bitmap in a processor. So we had created a platform, The Art of Others. For those of you who haven't seen it, the Smithsonian Institution, the American National Museum, did a display in 2012 called The Art of the Video Game. And then they turned it into a display which is moving around museums in the United States. And because what we had in fact done is created a platform for other people's art, except that this time we brought the story home and they got to define the story, not the writers somewhere else. We thought we needed to move fast because we thought the market was going to kill this machine in 2 years. We didn't know what we were. You don't know. But we had the nice problem of it lasted longer than we expected. It was much more likely that somebody else would have come in and squashed us. So, where to learn more? Okay, find Racing the Beam. It actually has chapters on Adventure and Pac-Man and Yar's Revenge and Pitfall and a Star Wars game. And it talks about the first video game crash. There's a book called Atari Business is Fun. Friends of mine wrote it. It is, in my opinion, the definitive social history of Atari during the incorporated period before the Trammels got hold of it. Warren Robinette is working on a book on the annotated adventure. It's actually going to explain how it all works. And the book that I want to write, I want to port it to the PCS. A lot of that stuff is online. And I've written an article about it, which if you're a member of the IEEE Explore or get access to this, you can read it. Here's how to find me. And I think I'm coming right up on questions. Flooding into the mind of the concerned young person today. Yes, sir.
I might be revealing my ignorance in the whole technical aspect of things.
It's not ignorance. You just don't know. That's okay. We're all born clean slate.
Instead of just crashing and not doing anything, why do we put in a cartridge into a PCS and flick the power switch a couple times? Does it still play the game, but just weirdly?
I would need to reproduce that to know. Ordinarily, if you just plug in a cartridge and don't flip the switch, the processor is not initialized, which means it could land anywhere. Now, whenever you plug it in, the processor has one 16-bit number in its program counter, but you probably haven't initialized any of the other registers. So it might, in fact, by luck, fall into a game, but fall into that game into a place that was not intended from an initial entry point. So yes, it will play weirdly. The fact that it's running at all is amazing, because mostly it just displays bars. But if you drop into a random game in a random place with uninitialized registers, it can't not play weirdly. Yes, sir. Both of you, 1 and 2.
All right. So you kept mentioning how the game designers and software people maybe were a bit more clever than you expected.
Duh,
They
yes.
came up with it. I noticed that you kept saying that they're more clever than you expected and not more clever than you. I was just curious. Because
Well, no, there are a lot of ways to have failure of imagination, you know. We came in with, here's your charter. You have to be able to make this work and this work with these economics at this time in history. And Moore's Law was happening. Moore's Law was this giant wave that was washing over us. We knew, for example, that more stuff was going to come along. But we were just at the juncture between it's not possible at all, and we're going to have a bitmap. And we were early at the in-between point, and driven by being game designers rather than being hardware manufacturers. But even still, we put the control of the vertical in the hands of the programmers, not because we were smart, but because we were being cheap. And then they blew us away. There was a hint. Did I answer you?
Joe, can I add to that?
Yes, please.
The real lucky accident was, as he said, putting stuff into the chip was expensive. But there's a ROM cartridge here. So anything that you could do to take functionality out of the hardware and put in the ROM is free, because there's already a ROM there. Okay? They didn't care that every time they put something in the ROM, it was less ROM for us to make the game. They cared that it was free to use the ROM.
Relatively free.
Relatively free. When they did that, they made it so that the system that's in your house already has one set of functionality, but the ROM changes every time you plug in a new game. So the more capability they gave to the ROM, the more versatile they made the system. And it was just, that's the lucky accident, is the less that the hardware constrains the game, the more the software controls it, and it's the software that changes every time.
Exactly. And as part of our lessons learned when we designed the next system, which is the subject of a book I'm working on, we knew that we had to allow the programmers to do more than simply animate the bitmap. We had to allow them to follow the beam in some fashion and change things as it went. We could add hardware to accelerate some things, but we had to make it as versatile and general as possible. Now there was a hand, and then there was a hand, and then a hand. So 1, 2, 3, 4. This is going to take a while. Keep going.
So out of the Atari Age kiosk, they've got a port of Sonic the Hedgehog. And my question is, what are your thoughts on this machine that you designed? Pretty faithfully emulating the capabilities of a machine that was designed 14 years after.
One word, awe. A-W-E. The fact that they could do Sonic the Hedgehog, the fact that they can do Halo, just amazes me. Anyway, let me leave it at that. And, oh, yeah. Again, if we had spent a dollar extra and put in 40-pin 6502 and 30-pin ROM, rewrite in phase 2, okay, we could have evolved the architecture. The other thing is, we could have used the interrupt out of the 6530 and displayed the chessboard while the code was going off figuring out what the next move was, instead of having to just put up bars, just changing color. There's so many things we could have done, but it's too late now. Anyway, there was a kid here, and then there was a bunch more, and they'll have me doing this until they have to kick you out.
Yeah, I'm actually here all the time.
Well, that kid has been waiting.
My question, I've heard that the Fairchild Camera and the arcade caused the Atari be sold to Warner Brothers to rush 600 and make it more powerful. Is that true at all? Or?
That's, no. What was true was Atari looked ahead and figured out how much money it was going to take to buy the material and build the factory. And we were shooting for a much larger market than those people were going after. We didn't have the resources of Fairchild. So we had to sell out to somebody, and we sold out to Warner because Warner was also an entertainment company. And they understood entertainment. Warner actually had lots of commercial music. They made movies. They were in that space. And we were an electronics company, but we became part of Warner because they were also about entertainment. In fact, there was a period in the late 70s and early 80s where people had Atari t-shirts, and down at the bottom it had t-shirts that said Warner, and down at the bottom said Atari Company. Because we were most of their business for a while. I think I'm off. I'd like to make the same deal that you made for the last person, get another 5 minutes, because I'll answer questions. Well, where's Howard?
Right here.
Bingo. Come on up.
Thank you. Thank you for what you did with that chip.
I don't know if you got here early enough, but when I was listing off my best original games for this platform, Yar's Revenge is one of them. Okay, come on up. I'll answer questions and I'll hand off control. Understood. All right? Clean up after yourselves. Okay. Any other questions that I can handle? Yes, sir.
So I'm just curious, kind of going on what this guy said earlier about like games being, or developers being faster than the actual hardware.
Smarter.
Being smarter.
I'm not quite sure I understand your question. You're talking about digital distribution. Now, this is a system which came out in 1977. So digital distribution now means what? The dominant game platform now is that smartphone in my pocket. Okay? So yes, people can sell games. The Atari Age people are building code for emulators and hard systems. But unless people are putting the emulators on here, it doesn't really matter. What's true is people are developing all kinds of platforms to build games on top of. Like Atari, Microsoft for Windows built a game control interface, and then they made a whole concept, whole platform, the Xbox, out of what was originally designed to just put games on top of Windows. And if someone is trying to build a successful platform now, as some companies are, like Steam, if they wanted to build, they have to build something that's versatile enough to write the games that most people are willing to pay attention to. And they can make, there are lots and lots of ways to build a soft platform now. I'm just amazed that people are still doing stuff for the 2600 at all, right? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I was just kind of seeing what your take on that was.
Besides awe, more awe, I think. Yes, sir.
Were you behind the decision to remove the internal speakers of the 2600 to have it sent to the TV?
That wasn't my decision, but it saved money for one, and for two, frequently the sound coming out of the TV was better than coming out of the console, because if you're playing this thing and your eyes are focused on the avatar which is on the TV, it's better from a human factor standpoint to have the sound come out of the same place.
So if you saved $1 on the speakers, you would have put that with the,
No, but you want the sound to come from where the image is coming from. It's actually better, even if it costs us money, to have it come out of the TV instead of out of the
so it
console.
looks like the console was originally designed for it.
Yes, I know. If you take them apart, there's room for that. There you are. One more question. I want to hand the floor to my buddy here. Seeing none, we're done. Thank you very much.